panel session. I'm looking very much forward to that, and I think that will really also build on and enhance our discussions on what some models might be for these kinds of interactions that we've been having here at the conference. And then, of course, we'll have our little closing session with some reflections on the conference and a few comments about next steps. So, without further ado, let me ask the rapporteurs from the from the breakout groups to come forward, and maybe let me suggest that we take that in the following order. Let's do energy, agriculture, water, health. So, energy first.
Morning. I'm Erica Lively, and I'm a PhD candidate in electrical engineering at UC Santa Barbara, and I'm also a science fellow with the Center for Nanotechnology and Society. So on Wednesday, our breakout group focused mainly on thinking about actual technologies that had the potential to have positive impacts in developing economies and for the needy. But yesterday, our discussion focused more on what sort of frameworks and partnerships do you need in order to actually bring those technologies to a productive and positive place in the developing world. So our discussion really focused around two big questions. The first was, who are the important actors in these partnerships, and what are their roles in creating and sustaining partnerships that will empower the needy and support emerging economies? So it turns out there are a lot of actors, and there are some important interactions. So the first actor that we identified are physical scientists and engineers. So they really need to listen to the needs and constraints of the developing world, commit to low-cost, reliable, and sustainable solutions, and also showcase those innovations and their potential for impact. So having transparent technology and honest engineering that can be shown to other engineers to take into different countries and different, villages. And then another important actor are social scientists. And I thought that this was pretty brilliant. I spend a lot of time as a scientist saying, well, what can I do? And in the session yesterday, Professor Applebaum said, well, what can social scientists do? It's like, wow, everybody thinks like this. This is pretty great. But, but I think that they serve a really crucial role. And one of the most important things is to facilitate communication about the cultural and social barriers that we've been hearing about, that engineers and scientists don't always understand. And they need to advise scientists on the needs and the constraints of the users, and to provide design feedback related to those cultural issues. And I think it's also important for them to design processes for participation in technological development between those engineers and other groups like businesses and governments. And so the next actor is government. What does the government really need to do in order to make a successful implementation of technology that will really improve the lives of people in its country? They need to establish a supportive policy framework and work at the appropriate level to meet the development needs. We know that in some countries, a national technology policy will not affect people in the village, but we know that a local community policy will. So it's important to recognize which governments we're talking about and how they can have an impact. And they also need to provide funding and an infrastructure for development, and create venues and incentives for collaborations and partnerships between all of these actors. And then moving on to entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, industry, NGOs. I realize this encompasses a lot of people in the audience, so I apologize if just lumping you all together seems awkward, but really the role is to form strategic partnerships with scientists, social scientists, and government, and to fund and disseminate appropriate technology. And all of those people need to be in place in order to do that. And finally, what's the role of nanotechnology, or in some cases, just existing technologies? And it's really a tool to improve the quality of life and the economy of developing countries. And I want to point out that it's not, this end-all solution, but it is a crucial tool in helping the developing world. And additionally, I think technology can be used to inspire students to, pursue education and to help change, the circumstances that maybe they came from. And it can inspire a new generation of people to be innovators and creators. So how do you bring all of these people together? I think one really exciting way that our group identified is innovation centers and having a key strategy for fostering partnerships. So innovation centers could serve as a meeting place for actors to build those bridges. So not just scientists or not just social scientists, but bringing together, industry, venture capitalists, entrepreneurs, and really seeing a lab technology get developed all the way through to a prototype that can be tested in the field and have an actual proof of concept. So a lot of times there's a gap between how do you take a great idea and actually turn it into something useful? And we think that this would be a really great way to provide funding, testing, and also foster cultural understanding and have a rapid development phase for actually implementing technology. And they would also serve as a place for developing countries to learn from other developing countries. Since we know that countries are all in different stages of the development cycle, it seems like there are going to be common challenges, but also common projects that can be collaborated on. So an exchange of scholars and ideas coming from these centers would be really exciting. But as positive and as progressive as this is, it's important also to take stock of how well you're doing and how much your technology is actually making an impact. So the returns on nanotechnology investments have generally been low up to this point. I guess that's sort of a relative measure, but they certainly haven't been the $3 trillion that has been projected. And that may not come for another 20 plus years. So in the meantime, how do you evaluate, really what the true impact is of implementing a technology program? And a few of the ways that we've highlighted, revenue is definitely one of them, because if a government is putting money into a program, it should get some return on its investment. But also, it's important to consider quality of life improvements within that country. If poor people are really being aided by, job creation or technology that's helping their way of life. And another really interesting one is public trust in nano. Is this really going to be a technology that's going to take countries into the next phase of their development? And that really can't be done unless the public is behind it. And also, just a national pride and scientific accomplishment. Are students being inspired? Does the country feel like this is really the foundation for their future? So a couple of suggestions that we came up with for moving forward. On a larger scale and longer term, we really think that these innovation centers are an exciting way to move forward. But in addition to that, there also needs to be an ongoing international dialogue within the organizations represented here and others that aren't represented here, like UNIDO or the UNDP. And one thing that we talked about was public engagement, but we didn't have a lot of really solid ideas for moving that forward. And I study how the media portrays technology, and I think the media could be a really useful tool in working out things like the public perception of technology and fostering pride in technology. So engaging the media, engaging NGOs, and thinking about how else we can really move technology forward in the public. And then on a smaller scale, shorter term, hosting an online forum or a hub for people who are interested in technology in the developing world and how they can communicate with each other from all countries and in all stages of development. And another really important point is not to wait for a funded initiative, but to keep the momentum going, to think about the 1 or 2 partnerships that you can form and really move forward with those. And also to host a green online conference instead of bringing people by plane from all over the world. Do it online and do it frequently so that people can meet and update progress, and maybe even produce collaborative writings available in multiple languages that can be disseminated throughout the represented countries. Thank you.
Any quick additions from other group members? Questions? Andrew, do you have a...
Thanks. Andrew Maynard, Wilson Center. I noticed, in fact, you might actually want to get back to the microphone. I noticed that though you mentioned public engagement at the end of that, if you looked at the list of groups that would be fully engaged in the emerging technologies enterprise, you didn't have communities there. And I wondered whether you actually talked about the role of communities in actually developing and utilizing emerging technologies alongside those other stakeholders.
We did talk about communities, but I think we were focused more on those initiation points for public engagement. So we were trying to think of, sort of ways to incite people's interests. And so we were definitely talking about getting people engaged on a community level, but like having a community activist or a volunteer or something, that didn't really come up, actually. But it's a good idea. I'll add it to the list.
Question from Bishop in the back.
I'm Usha Balakrishnan from a nonprofit called Karta in Iowa City, Iowa. I'm going to follow up on Andrew Maynard's comment and just give an example. So I live in Iowa City, which is the home of the University of Iowa. I run this nonprofit, but I have several hats where I serve on program committees of the university. And so I get to see which scientists are good communicators and invite them as speakers to Café Scientifique programs that I organize, to the Rotary Club that I'm a part of. I think there are lots and lots of community members who care very deeply about science. And if scientists were teamed up with them, they could be brought into the community picture. So this is a form of very low levels of nano literacy that you build over a period of time rather than a PR blitz. But I think we are at a stage where we want to talk about science in an enthusiastic way, not to overpromise and underdeliver, but that the public support of science demands obligations on scientists to come and speak to community members. And these are all very nice forums where scientists can share their aspiration. I feel wonderful as a public citizen to know about what they're doing in their labs. So public engagement can come in various forms.
Can I ask you a question about that? Do you think that would work in a more developing country as well, that model of pairing a community member with a scientist?
Yes. The only potential problem that I see is two things. The scientists cannot be arrogant when they come into the community. They have to learn to really speak along with the community's interests. And the second thing is you do need the capacity to communicate a little bit from the non-technical side. Now, most of the presenters in this conference obviously were great communicators. right?
A couple of comments on that topic, I think.
Okay. I'm Anuradha Ganesh from IIT Bombay. I would like to reflect upon this on behalf of the group yesterday, and also the fact that I represent a developing country. I'm also a member of the Rotary Club, so let me just give you an answer to your question and this, which we discussed yesterday. It's imperative that the scientists inform the public through the communities. At the same time, it's imperative that they do not overdo it. That's the worry which was, that's a concern which was put across. And therefore, it may be a good idea to go a little slow till the technology is like totally well established. For example, if you look at the community in particular, they more than the energy and climate, it's the health issues which probably which is very important. And in the nano area, maybe that would they'll immediately see what are the applications. And if we overdo it, it's going to be a disaster. We want to ensure that the technology is not curbed before it grows. So we have to be careful on that.
Yes, Paulo Martins, São Paulo. I have a program in TV by internet about nanotechnology. This is part of the project of public engagement. The name of the program is Nanotechnology Inside Out, because he invite people that is doing nanotechnology to discuss the impacts of nanotechnology in society, environment, in economy, to discuss things that are not discussing in the place where nanotechnology is doing. But in general, Brazilian scientists that is doing nanotechnology doesn't like to tell for the no specialized public about nanotechnology.
Guillermo, and then Jeff, and then I'd like to move on to the next presentation. This theme is going to come back, and so is the other presentations. So, not the end of the discussion.
Guillermo Foladori. There are two things that should not be confused. On one side is the possibility of dialoguing between public and scientists, exchange ideas, and so forth. Another thing completely different is who are the social forces that will push forward an alternative program, in this case for energy or for whatever. This is completely different because you need there a previous organized people, and public in general or public at large doesn't play any role at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff Tansey. Couple of questions. When you grouped NGOs, entrepreneurs, business, etc. together, did you have any discussions about the differing power relations and the relative power of those different groups to drive things in different directions? Secondly, you mentioned the development cycle. Was there any discussion that there actually may be very different development paths that people could go on, or is there a vision that there is one direction everything goes towards? And finally, a comment, picking up on what was said behind me by Anita. That approach would certainly worry us in the Food Ethics Council, because we think that is a very unethical position to take, that you don't talk about things until you've got it all sorted, because the position should be that society should be involved in deciding both the direction of research and whether or not some of it should go in the direction maybe scientists would want to take it, because maybe society would say we don't want to take it there, which is the case of what happened in the use of nuclear energy for civil engineering projects.
Okay.
Do you want to take a go at that, or some of the group members? Go ahead.
I'll try.
Sure.
So, in terms of the power relationships between things like funders and NGOs, that didn't actually come up in terms of there ever being a real sort of struggle between people trying to take things in different directions. We did talk about the fact that if you put money into a program as a venture capitalist, you want to see a return. So you have to consider that. But we didn't really, take into account, maybe that funding agency completely driving that project. Development pathways. So I think one really crucial thing about these innovation centers that we highlighted is that they need to be as close to the community that the technology is going for as possible. So incorporating that community feedback, we've talked about, has been crucial from day one. So there has been talk about that community element. And in terms of there being certain development pathways or innovation pathways, one thing our group has been really good at highlighting is that there is no one solution or pathway for every country. That in some countries, government will play a huge role. In some countries, it will play almost no role. And so I think that there's a pretty clear consensus that there's really no single model that's going to work for everyone. So that's why it's important for those centers to be as close to the area of deployment as possible.
Thank you. Let's hear from the Ag and Food Security.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Jennifer Rogers. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at UC Santa Barbara. Happy to be here and report back from food security. In our lively breakout session yesterday, we continued our discussion of food security as it relates to nanotechnology. Our discussion revealed that nano in food and agriculture is nascent, and therefore we found ourselves often referring to other examples of technology applications for food security. Most of our group questioned how unique nano is from other technological advancement. However, several key issues did emerge from the discussion about specific applications of nanotechnology in food. And I highlight three of them here, although we discussed many of them. One of the first key issues was public health, such as that may come from the issues of consumption of nano-enhanced food. One example was nanosilver as it's potentially being used in pesticides, and it might be environmental impacts through soil, water, and land implications from nano, and this also might come from pesticides or nano encapsulation of pesticides or the nutrients as they change seeds and soil, or even through water purification. Lack of public information. This actually goes a lot to what Erica was speaking about earlier, and there's actually a lot of overlap between the two groups and our discussions. Some of the insights, I focus here on a few different countries, and our group was actually extremely diverse. We had representation from so many different countries, and a few of the discussions we had, one was about an example from Brazil, the Embrapa, one of the national research institutes. They've recently patented something called artificial tongue. They're working on food preservation, testing food quality, using sensors. But what was noted is that there has been a lack of public awareness and participation and regulation, which is a theme through most of this, about these new patents, about the potential of nanotechnology being used in food and agriculture. And in China, there is a history of technological transfer for food production from the government to the farmers. And we discussed barriers to that, how easy or difficult that is to do, and issues for nanotechnology within that system. There's also a recent paper on the biofortification of rice within China. And in India, as another example, there are new approaches to science and working with stakeholders. So the national government can work with private interests and NGOs to facilitate communication with farmers. One of the projects has to do with cleaning up arsenic out of soil and adding phosphorus to the seeds, I believe it was, to the plant. And so we discussed many different applications as it's being used around the world. And some of the actions we discussed related to these social issues. One, for food and nano applications, we said we really need to develop a dialogue with the farmers and people using these products, especially as they have to do with changes to soil and seeds, and talk about the specific needs, cultural practices, and long-term feasibility of these products and programs. And this definitely relates back to how do we do that? How do we engage people? How does this look in developing countries and in different places around the world? And I would agree, too, that there was definitely a lot of discussion that this does look different around the world. It's not one kind of way to do it. Also, the issue of public health. There are potential risks around embodiment of, using this food that has been changed through nanotechnology, or even barcodes or sensors and all of that, and pesticides. The perceived risks are higher with food applications. And here's a place where we can actually think of nanotechnology as potentially different than other technologies. How are these risks perceived differently with food versus energy or other applications? We also considered that animal health is part of this. It's not just about the land, soil, but animals, as animals are affected through changes to their diet or even their bodies and their growth, because especially as humans consume animals. And there's discussion the increase and value of public information. What role will traditional and non-traditional media play in our information component? We also discussed what is the role of media, what are they doing now, what could they be serving in the future, and what are some alternative media outlets. We discussed research collaborations between the government, civil society, scientists, consumers, and users in the implementation of development projects. And this is very much in parallel to the previous presentation about how does this look, how can collaborations happen between these groups, although I don't think we got into as much detail about that, except for a couple countries. With governance issues, we just spent quite a bit of time on this, discussing different situations around the world. We discussed that, once again, this does look different depending on where you are. There are global, national, and local governance issues, and what's happening at the national level may be different than what's happening at the local level, as terms of policy formation, implementation, and enforcement of these policies. Regulation is fairly new and mostly non-existent around the world, and additional stakeholder participation is needed in terms of governance of what do people want, what does industry need, what do scientists look for in terms of governance. A couple examples: China, and this is not exactly with agriculture, but it's definitely related. Where we discussed that latest news article, the news about some workers that were working in a factory that uses nanotechnology and paint, and they were killed and injured. And we discussed this potential. Part of this was a lack of enforcement of this workplace and issues of safety. And maybe how does this affect agricultural workers who might be using these products and working in the soil, working on the land? And we also discussed U.S. and U.K. that there is more in the U.S. Also the EU. We can look at REACH as an example of actually something that encompasses more nanomaterials than just CNTs, but we do see some regulation being towards CNTs. We can look at some recent policy in California and Berkeley. But this all may lead to more regulations as people, we've discussed how governments and different groups are trying to figure out what needs to be regulated. How is this different than other applications of technology within food and agriculture? How is pesticides being enhanced through nanotechnology different? Does that need to be separated out? Because right now, most regulation of pesticides is nanotechnology falls under regulation of pesticides. So some of the discussion that came out of this is that we need to, once again, as the same presentation we came from yesterday on food, is that we need to remember the lessons that we've learned in this area. And especially for this, what have we learned from the regulation of pharmaceuticals, health, and labor? And we also show that experience with self-regulation, people in the group were mostly all unhappy with just relying on self-regulation or voluntary regulation of nanotechnology, and they're hoping for more and believe the public is looking for more than self-regulation. The nano industry is also looking for rules and clarity to protect them from liability claims, so it's also in their interest to know what do they need to do. They may not want to be regulated to the severity that maybe some people are hoping, but they are looking for some rules and clarity. And trust is also another theme that went through all of this. Trust in governments, trust among scientists, or trust of scientists. And the question of how can we hold science and industry and government accountable in relation to all of this. And that, once again, this is a role of public engagement, opportunities for talking to people and engaging the public in these questions. So, putting out a few things here that I think actually relate to what we just were talking about, and which is wonderful because, I think many people are hoping that from this discussion we can talk about what are our next steps, where will we be going. And here's a few of the things that I think came from our discussion, or at least related to it, such as we need to examine the timeline for nano food and agriculture. And I think this added some of the difficulty to the discussion, because where is nano in food and agriculture right now? What is out there, and what is the future of it? Is it 5 years? We had trouble getting to the topic of commercialization because so much of this is new, and it's harder to point to actual applications that are happening in the field right now. So we would like some more research on this timeline. And shall we charge ourselves with the task to help relay and understand the social and ethical dimensions of nano and food applications? Is that our job as experts or as this educated group to examine these social and ethical dimensions? And if so, then how do we relay this to the public? And this perhaps can be part of a call for transparency and open source sharing of these technologies. There has been discussion of the issues of intellectual property and patents, and maybe open source is an alternative to that. But how does that really apply in this case of food and agriculture? And in what ways does our group play a role in how nano is received as a hope or a fear? And this may be particular to these different applications. And what is our role in seeking distributive justice? And this is particularly important in the case of developing countries and people working in developing countries that want to empower farmers or give them the tools that are necessary, or seek out what tools do they need. And this, I think, is very similar to what Erica was just saying. Once again, we're looking at nano as a tool. It's one of our tools in our toolkit. And we asked, well, when is it the appropriate tool for equitable development? Without just assuming that it is the answer for everything. When is it appropriate? Okay, that's it for my presentation. Thank you.
Any additions from other group members? Questions? Noella? She's right here. Okay, thanks.
Hello, I am Noela from the Federal University of Paraná in Brazil. Most of the issues you told about were on something that is, you highlighted feeding people and how nanotechnology can help feeding people in developing countries. But I wonder if you consider also the impact of integrating nanotechnology to agriculture worldwide, and the impact that this will have on communities, on land property, on social bonds, as it happens as well with GMOs.
Perhaps other people in the group can talk about this, but I know I've personally absolutely agree with you that that is a very important topic, but it wasn't a focus. It did come up in our discussions, but it wasn't as much of a focus as perhaps it should be. And if we had more time, I know we would have spent time on that. And we did say these are things that we do need to examine, but we didn't get as far as some specifics. And perhaps some group members would like to speak to that as they see fit, or what they think are important issues. I think Jeff wants to. Okay.
Question from Chris here. It's not on. Can somebody?
Yes, I just want to make just a general comment. This consultation with the public and having input from the public on developing technologies and so forth, I think there are some countries where it's practical and more practical than in other countries. Now, just listening to, and we are making quite a bit of noise about it, I was thinking of all countries in Africa. Your 70% of the population is rural, and a lot of the issues we are talking about here, they wouldn't know what you are talking about. The rural people are interested in, does it rain? Can I go into my field to plow? Can I get some yield? Those are the fundamentals. To go and say, now, Mr. So-and-so, can we use nanotechnology in your field? They wouldn't know what you're talking about. So I just wanted to say that indeed these are good points, but they are relevant in certain societies where society at large is at that level where it can you can communicate it and it makes sense to them. I'm afraid in my community it won't make sense. Thank you.
Thank you. Barbara Harthorne, UC Santa Barbara. I have one comment about Noella's point about land tenure, I think, which speaks to a bigger issue about how the assumptions that we're making about what equitability is about. So yesterday I was trying to show that gender discrimination is an equitability issue that's tied very closely to technological development and who will benefit. But the issue of land tenure in developing countries is absolutely critical, and so the equitability issue is going to be tied directly to who has land and who doesn't, because that's who can farm and who can't, and that's who controls the means of production. And so I think we need to think in a very critical way about what we're assuming. I think we've sort of taken as a starting point the assumption that equitability is, about income per se, as opposed to a much broader sense of what needs to be equitable about technologies and thinking about them. And then just to take on what Chris was just saying, even in the U.S., in our deliberations, in our public deliberations, we convene the public, and as you know, the public do not feel that they know what they need to know to deliberate about nanotechnology. But the reality is they know everything they need to know to deliberate about the social risks of technology. And so part of this is about how we assume scientific knowledge rather than other kinds of information and knowledge are the essential part of deliberation.
Thank you. Let's continue with the next group. Thank you,
Right.
Jennifer.
Oh, question was asked.
You, Jeff, thank you.
Okay, thanks very much.
Another.
Picking up on those different things, one of the general points we made, if you're thinking about food security, it is much more complex than anything about a particular technology, whether it's nano or any other technology. And that then it picks up on some of the points that were made about land tenure and communicating. It's about the way we do R&D, and it's not simply about saying you go out and talk about technology, and this particular nanotechnology. It's about what do people need in their community, how do you look at equity, and as Barbara was saying, it's not just about income, it's about power, who has what power, how they can marshal the social, the economic and the technical things they might need to improve their living conditions where they are, and that will vary in different places. So we did acknowledge around that there was a lot more set of complex issues around this than trying to think just about a technology.
Yep, good reminders. Thank you. Thanks, Jennifer.
Good morning. My name is Meredith Conroy, and I'm a PhD candidate at UC Santa Barbara, and I study political psychology. So I'm here to represent, or try to represent, the discussion yesterday from the water group. I guess it was my role to synthesize and organize kind of things we were talking about. I'll do my best. I did warn our group that if they didn't give me enough to talk about, I would sort of give an ethnographic report, but they gave me plenty. But it doesn't mean that I didn't sort of use, I made some of my own judgment calls with the organization of this. So hopefully they approve. But I feel like so I'll move straight to the talk. Two of the topics we discussed as a group, and I feel like have been a theme throughout this conference, is this idea of, is a proposed solution technologically feasible and is it culturally feasible? And I think that demonstrates the importance of groups like this and why we come together and to address these questions. My first point here, consider this cross-discipline mixing, I guess, a lot of the actors that Eric had listed. It's important to get all of these groups and organizations and people together because we do have this idea of, is it technologically feasible and culturally feasible? And this all needs to be considered. And another way we might address these questions, as our group did, is this idea of notions of scale and risks and benefits. And I'll talk about each of these in turn. So to address cultural feasibility and technological feasibility, we have to consider notions of scale. What we were talking about is what is the scale at which we'll be proposing our solution? Is this going to be a household proposition, or for the community, or for urban, or for commercial? And I understand that at each of these levels, commercial can be woven in, but I guess at commercial for in this scale, it's more of a larger scale. And those are just three. Drinkable water, gray water, and waste. These are three areas where we'll have to consider these notions of scale. And at each point, we'll have to consider cultural implications and the culture itself in whether or not we can execute these three areas, and at which scale it might be different across each for a community. Another thing to consider when we're thinking about technological feasibility and cultural feasibility are the risks and benefits, which has also been a theme throughout this conference. As Barbara was just discussing, this idea of a cultural perspective is important because perceived risks and actual risks are very different. What I do at the Center for Nanotechnology at UC Santa Barbara is largely public opinion of people from the United States, but this idea of what is perceived risk and actual risk is very important. And one of the ways that you can analyze risks and benefits throughout the entire process of a proposed solution is to use a value chain. And our group discussed value chain sort of in the abstract, but at UC Santa Barbara, this summer we did sort of look at value chains for 3 months, and their visual representation, and I didn't put one on the slide here, but it's this idea of you have inputs, manufacturing, production, distribution, and consumption, and at each one of those points, you have risks and benefits to culture and to technology. And then there's also supporting environments that we did talk about in our group. We talked about intellectual property, financing, public perception, and media. And you're getting the what it looks like is that we came up with more questions than answers, but we did bring up a lot of different topics. And it's important to consider that at each one of the points of a value chain, not only do you have different people, but you have money, media, perception, and research. So we touched a little bit on that. Again, not a lot of answers, just a lot of questions. And then we also talked about bringing it back to water. What our group is encompassing and nano, bring it back to water, and nanotechnology. We sort of, after talking about all these things, what can nanotechnology, the question was asked by Raphael, what does nanotechnology bring to this? Why should I leave this conference saying nanotechnology matters to water? And so I was looking at, I took some of kind of the recommendations that our group had talked about and put them in these 3 areas of purification, storage, and desalinization, and that nanotechnology really does and can play a really important role in bringing clean water or ways to store water to developing countries. And then, again, after you can make a recommendation, which will differ for each community and each scale, we think about the implementation and bringing it back again to water. Water is a very special case. Some people are less willing to pay for water. It's deeply embedded with government, and then we talked about different gender roles that are associated with water in different communities. In a lot of communities, you have women who are responsible for going and fetching the water, and so those are also things that you need to consider with our particular area. And then lastly, we talked about who can do this implementation. Will it be market-based, government-supported, our national government organizations, public and private, and then also we discussed different foundations, especially when there's not, again with water, there might not be an opportunity for a commercial enterprise. And if there's not an opportunity for a commercial enterprise, then we might be more want to involve different foundations. And in conclusion, I guess I'm going to bring it back to this idea of cultural and technical feasibility and how we have to consider each step of a value chain and at what point things are going to work and at what point things are going to fall apart because we didn't consider all aspects of science and of the culture. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to participate in something like this that brings it all together, and hopefully we can leave here all understanding that it'll take us all to create the change that will be necessary. And that is all from me. And open up questions, and I'll defer them all to the experts.
Any additions from that group? Good questions? Or
we asked ourselves a question which we'd like to pose to everybody else, because we had this rather nice combination of natural scientists and social scientists. If you thinking historically about innovation, the difference between technologies which are incremental in nature, technologies which are radical in nature, that is, they change processes fundamentally, and then technologies which are revolutionary, transformative. And the question to our technical people was, in your judgment, in the nano area water, is this a series of incremental, radical, or transformative? Can I report back what I heard from our group and then see whether others have the same thing? Mostly it was at the incremental, radical end. There was no technical person in our group who said, you know what, this is a transformative technology, which is a change in historical technological epoch. We asked ourselves the question, it would be interesting to know what other groups think about the same issue.
interesting question. Any reactions? To that question?
Why don't you say a little more about what you mean by transformative?
And give an example.
Industrial revolution.
Well, firstly, I don't want to privilege my own expertise, but economic historians have looked back in the last 300 or 400 years and basically have identified a series of what are called long waves, 50-year cycles of economic activity, first identified by a Russian in 1917, a Minister of Agriculture. The question really is what drives those, and Schumpeter in the 1930s argued that these are ways which are driven by core heartland technologies. So cheap energy was the last one. Is nanotechnology transformative in the sense that it sweeps across sectors? I loved the story about stones yesterday. The Stone Age didn't end because of a shortage of stones, but you have a superior technology, and very importantly, the work of Venezuelan Carlota Perez, coming with these transformative technologies are socio-technical systems, so that they change social organization as well. Mass production was around concentrated production and concentrated aggregations of people. Microelectronics is around distributed production, so you have smaller scale production in many senses and distributed social patterns. So, I mean, there's a whole debate about it, but the question is, in this level of, is there a technological revolution out there which is going to shake us in the way that electronics shook us? That's the question.
Anybody from the physical sciences, from the other sectors who would like to?
Mike Rocco suggested in the first day, I thought that it was.
Yeah, I think so. Susan?
Well, I did make a suggestion in the group, not generically, because there's a huge debate around whether the nanotechnologies and nano approaches are a general purpose technology that will be revolutionary. But within water, I did make the suggestion, a couple people picking up on our previous conversation, that actually the lab on a chip that individuals could use, that everybody could have one, and you could tell whether your water was clean or was healthy or unhealthy for you, would actually transform the market for water significantly, because part of the problem with water is you actually can't tell what you're getting by looking at it from a consumer or a user's standpoint. I thought we had a little bit of head nodding in the group yesterday on that, specifically in the water area, and it's just an example of how it's really important to break down specific technologies in relation to specific areas rather than completely rely on the discussion around general purpose technology.
Well, I'll boldly go where no social scientist has gone before. And I try to interpolate what Mike Rocco would answer, because he's been the biggest booster on this argument. And, according to he has a kind of a fourfold stage of nanotechnology, which the final stage is being out next 10 or 15 years, which is supposed to be truly revolutionary. And I can't begin to explain the physics of it or the chemistry of it, but it will lead to organic-based computing, which will be higher speed than anything conceived of now, which will transform the nature of communication and so forth. Self-replicating nanosystems, which will... Well, I'm going to actually stop there, because I'll have to make something up and I'll be proven wrong. But the promise, or some would say the hype behind nanotechnology, is that it will be world-transforming. Whether or not that's the case, hopefully I'll live to see.
Actually, before I go to Jeff, I'd like to put somebody on the spot who's been working on this from the physical sciences side. Jambella, you probably trying to avoid eye contact. But could you talk about this from your perspective? You've been working sort of on the science policy, but also on the technical side, and looking at a range of applications across economic sectors for economic development and sectors for the social development side.
Yeah. Hi, Tembela from CSIR South Africa. Maybe to try and answer, and also avoiding the hype, which was something that we've been doing all along. When we started, we were saying there is science that has to inform the technology. And when we look at the science aspect, we're looking at it as just the evolution of science. We are at the stage now where we could probe at the nano regime and see these properties. But what is important is how to integrate them to get into that technology. So from the science base, it's just an evolution of science. Now to then come to transformative and radical and all that, sometimes we might put ourselves on the spot, because I don't think when the transistors were just developed 50 or 100 years, or about 1950 or something, people knew then that this is going to be transformative. But it was one big step. I think as we go forward, also understanding that we have, as Rocco would say, different phases in nanotechnology itself, where we have passive, active, and architectures. When we get to the architecture stage, maybe that will be transformative. But at this stage, by helping to enhance some of the things that we're using, which we can see, which can be enabled or integrated, for example, on the computers and everything, it seems to have a potential. I think I'll...
That's very helpful. Thank you. Any other reactions?
Yeah, I asked that question actually in a different way in our group, and I said, is it science fiction? And perhaps Richard's comment, which came from Star Trek, was very appropriate there. Because if you look at what the trend has been in food industry, what you look for is ever better mechanisms of control of your production processes to remove the messy, risky things. Some of those are labour, many of them are environmental, and of course farming is in a fundamentally environmentally based system. And the Star Trek replicator represented the science fiction vision of the perfect food system. There is no need for any of this messy stuff. You can combine anything you like to deliver you the food substance you want. Now, the way nanotech in some ways has been presented actually says maybe that isn't entirely science fiction. How far could nanotech transform everything we've seen about the way we produce commodities, physical commodities that require growing? And that goes to a point that was made by the... And when I said, could it... We talk about cotton, rubber. If that transformed the need for fibre production from the field, that changes the commodity markets. It changes who grows what where in the world. So I suppose my interest from knowing from the nanotech, and this is looking further ahead, is it conceivable that you could move down that way? Now, when people were talking about second, and then they go further, third generation of biofuels, the way I read what people say sometimes is that actually we can produce just grow anything, and we'll then transform it into something that's a fuel. Take that further, grow anything, and we'll transform it into something you can consume. And if you look at literature and visions of the future from science fiction, you'll find those are things that people play out. The Soylent Green kind of thing from the future. I've seen that science fiction movie. But it seems to me one of the hypes that's been given, or one of the possibilities that's been played for this technology, is that when the science is understood and we can manage and control at the nano level anything, then we can recombine it into anything. If that is true, then it's truly revolutionary. Which areas is it true? Possibly. And if it was that revolution, is it a revolution we want to go down?
Beam us forward, Rex. Well, I'll beam you to the next report. That's all I can do. Thank you very much, Meredith. Thank you.
How do you put it in the show? I don't use this often. Sorry. Hello, my name is Summer Gray, and I think I've met many of you, and I'm very happy to be here and be reporting on some of the issues that we talked about in the Nano Health breakout session. And before I begin, I think I'd like to weigh in on this conversation that was taking place just a few seconds ago about transformation in nanotechnology. And I think it's important to be very cautious of technological determinism when we're thinking about how technology drives history. I mean, maybe we need to be a little bit more complex in how we think about that, to not fall into some of the traps I think that, prior social thought has fallen into. And so I guess, and I'll talk about this in my presentation, this idea of incremental versus radical transformation in technology. And what's crucial to remember is the social factor. And maybe you won't agree with me, but in my reading of history, I think that transformation always is coupled with social transformation. And so technology alone isn't going to determine a massive transformation, at least in my reading of history. But I'd love to hear more thoughts about that after this presentation. So on to health. In the group, we had a hard time talking about health, and I think before we could begin to really grapple with this question, we had to lay out some definitional issues, and so this is always a good way to start. And so the question was raised, who are we talking about and what are we talking about? So we needed to think a little bit about how to define and understand health, because when we talk about health, we might be assuming a lot of things. For example, are we talking about disease? Are we talking about prevention, cure? So there's a lot of different things within the spectrum of health that might get forgotten when we just, talk about health in these kinds of ways. So we tried to be a little bit more aware of that when we were having this discussion. And also, categories like poor, developing, what do these mean? Are we allowing for the rich diversity that exists both between communities and within communities? And this is very important when we're talking about issues that are relevant to rural or remote communities and ones that are maybe more situated in urban contexts. And so these are very different things. And then before we could really feel that we could have a discussion about this, we had to get through the issue of deliberation and whom should we be talking with, not only who are we talking about. And so we had to think about what communities are actually involved and how and where should this kind of participatory dialogue take place. And so these are questions that should frame any beginning of thinking about problems, these basic definitions and these basic acknowledgments of inclusion, and this has to do with issues of power. Okay, so my group actually did something very interesting that I thought would be very helpful for other groups to think about, or as we leave, this might be a good framework from which we can come to some sort of tangible, concrete way of talking about nano-specific applications to not only health but other issues. And so we came up with this proof of concept case study, and the particular technology or imagined technology that we discussed were nano bed nets. And so this is a interesting strategy, I think, for grappling with some potential contributions of nanotechnology and focusing in on a specific case of tropical disease transferred by mosquitoes. And so in coming to this case, there were a certain set of implicit selection criteria that led us there. For example, we're interested in overall impact and benefit. So I think everybody is looking for a global, widespread solution or problem that can be addressed via nanotechnology. But also, we want to see change, and we want to talk about tangible, concrete things, so we're looking for near-term nanotechnology applications. And then, in order to make things happen, and this goes back to this issue of incremental versus transformative or radical technologies, it would be helpful to imagine things that we can do that already had a level of existing infrastructure for the development and dissemination of whatever technological innovation we're imagining. And so in the case of nano bed nets, there's already, as many of you know, a conventional technology for bed nets that is very problematic and needs improvement. And perhaps there are many ways that one could go about doing this. And so we were exploring the particular aspects of nanotechnology that would be relevant. And I have no technical expertise to go into exactly how that is, but if you have questions, I'm sure that the people that were in the workshop could elaborate on that. And additionally, what's specific to nanohealth that we came across in this breakout session is the IRB, the Institutional Review Board. This is something that I would imagine every person who deals with health research has to worry about. And so it would be advantageous to select select cases or potential problems where you could bypass this to speed it up, at least for this thought experiment. And when I say bypass, I mean that it already exists in its present form, so it wouldn't be this brand new exploratory idea to bring to an IRB board. I hope that makes sense. And so some of the challenges when we started to really talk about this and imagined it as a real thing that came up were the fact that, well, toxicity is unknown. So this problem of the unknown unknowns. You're bringing nanotechnology to communities, and we have no idea to supposedly protect them and prevent disease from spreading. Yet we don't know if we're bringing in agents that could potentially be harmful. So that's an issue. And then issues of trust, which Jennifer and her group on food and agriculture kind of touched on. So this has to do with the participation of the community, and that could be potentially a barrier. Also, international and national trade barriers, tariffs, and the problem of pirating, which is across the board a problem of spreading technologies that may not meet the certain criteria of safety and quality. And so basically what I did was I took this example and I tried to kind of elaborate on some general practical issues that we can consider when we're thinking about specific nanotechnology, nano applications to health problems specifically, and maybe more generally other problems that are relevant to people in the developing world and living in impoverished communities. So, for example, perhaps it would be useful to utilize existing infrastructure and focus on incremental rather than revolutionary technological change. Also, this problem of negotiating the evolving role of the government came up, and I won't talk too much about that, but I just wanted to include it here because I think it is a very important thing to consider, especially when we're talking about working within political and international political environments as well. And then considering health-related regulatory frameworks, and I'm not too clear on what that would mean for other the food or the other aspects of nanotechnology, but that's something to consider. Patents are a really big issue that need to be talked about. We did discuss them as potentially a source of empowerment, and so that would be an interesting discussion to have. How can patents be used to protect technologies that are really grassroots? And also the need to identify the community of stakeholders, which we actually got in nice detail and depth with, which was exciting. So, and then to close on, I want to comment on some what I think are some fundamental issues that we need to really think about. And this came up throughout the other presentations and in the discussion and the questions. This need for grassroots discourses and participation is crucial, and it seems that there's challenges in the different contexts that you're thinking about, but in order to avoid these more colonial kinds of approaches, I think it's essential, and it needs to be worked out. How are we going to do this? And not only that, how can we be mindful of and aware of internal power dynamics that exist within communities when we're trying to do this sort of grassroots participatory dialogue in not only the framing of problems, but also the thinking of solutions. And secondly, avoiding simple technological fixes. We tend to forget sometimes, I think, that there are both social and technological processes that need to be addressed, and sometimes the technological ones are more attractive. And so in thinking about a problem, sometimes there's a set of social dynamics that can maybe not as easily be addressed, but maybe it's very essential and important to think about those. And that might come out of a grassroots participatory environment where people can discuss and articulate the social dynamics that are, creating systems of oppression or whatever they might be. And so that's something that we need to avoid. And I liked the analogy of nanotechnology as part of a toolkit, and I would add social solutions to that toolkit as well that we should consider. And then lastly, we talked about, and I think we closed with this issue of the problem of so many pilot studies being done on communities. And so that should we decide that, through participatory deliberation, that nanotechnology is an appropriate avenue with which to explore and to try to address health-related issues, let us not start and then not finish what we've started. So the problem of starting here and then the funding goes away and then leaving. So committing to finishing and carrying out a project from its beginning to its end. And that's what I'll leave you with. So thank you.
Questions for this group? Actually, let's go to Rick because you were in that group. So here are your additions.
Actually, I won't add anything from the group. Moses had to leave, so he left this note with me, but I held on to it because I knew being in the group. He was in a different group, but I knew that his comment was directly relevant to what this group is about, so I just hung on to it for a couple of sessions. his observation is the problems in developing countries are real and need solutions now. Nanotechnology should come on board sooner than later. And I think that resonates with what Summer was talking about early on with respect to looking at things that are near term rather than long term. I guess the only other comment is I wouldn't have anything to add to the summary we just heard. I think it captured just about everything.
Maybe you would like to add another challenge to the list, and is the loss of the control of the body. Most of the technologies in health, for example, drug delivery or diagnosis, they are anticipating changes in the body. And this means that the body will not react at the moment it needs, but it will react before. This is a process of objectivation of the body and commodification of the body. I think it's a new frontier of the science to commodificate the body and to put it in the market. And this means that the persons will lose knowledge and might lose biological reactions because they will be anticipated by artifacts implanted. Thank you.
The point that I would add to that is that the provision of information and technology doesn't necessarily lead to acceptance. There's sort of this idea that you provide information and then people think about it and they decide to accept it. So that there are lots of, mental heuristics and cultural factors, the commodification of the body in health, same thing in water and agriculture. So there really has to be a more fine-grained understanding that just engaging the public doesn't always lead to acceptance, and it can lead to lots of things that technologists might not want, that commercializers might not want. So it's this idea that engaging the public doesn't always lead to what you might think is the natural outcome of the discussion.
Thomas Woodson from Georgia Tech. Did your group ever discuss something about incentivizing researchers to investigate these diseases in the poor countries? I mean, lots of rich countries, they only develop drugs for, let's say, heart disease, and they don't do disease detection for these diseases in the poor countries.
We didn't talk specifically about how to incentivize because we assume that these networks already exist, that there are already, you have networks of scientists who do this kind of work, and so the goal is to bring more understanding of the community to that work. But I agree with you that there is more of a need to further incentivize Western, scientists to be interested and to be, and so how to do that is an important question.
There was a recognition that neglected diseases are a big problem,
Yeah.
and the same incentives that, or the lack of incentives that are causing those diseases to be neglected diseases, for anybody working in the nanoscience community and engage in those quality.
From within the group, we also had a conversation about using researchers in country and building up their participation in these kinds of problem solvings. So we did look at, we did have a conversation about what the market would be interested in, and recognize that the market might not necessarily jump on board if there isn't a financial solution. The other thing we talked about at the end, which you didn't mention, was we did talk about open source. That's right. And how open source doesn't necessarily mean free, and how open source in these kinds of particular projects might also make it the kind of project that people in country would be able to participate in.
Got about 10 minutes left, so I'd like to also invite you to share any additional observations or insights you'd like to share coming across all the groups, things that you've really felt maybe you've got are thinking about things that you feel are missing from the conversation, maybe because of how it was structured across those sectors, and could be helpful for further exploration in the future. So any sort of broader observation would be really helpful. So David, and then over to the gentleman.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think is coming through some of the discussions are, I think, the need to go back to maybe this sort of technological optimist position and the sort of technological pessimist position. And I mean, for me, I think one of the most interesting but also frustrating things about our discussions is, from the point of view of thinking about development and, you know, transformation and equalities, the critical question, I think, is whether this is a moment where this new technology offers the opportunity to rethink what has been a very difficult relationship between technology and development. And I think it's hugely difficult. And I'm not really hearing all that much about, you know, how we can question that relationship. Because for the sort of techno-optimists, and I think many of us here have been taking that position, we're asking these questions, well, how do these technologies, you know, how do they help poor people? You know, what can we do with these technologies? Which, you know, in some ways is the way, it's the approach of the last 40 to 50 years. And I think the other way, you know, the other sort of current in these discussions, which is the more pessimistic view, is how do we protect poor people from these technologies and their effects? You know, how do we protect the most vulnerable people, you know, from these processes of technological change which are going on? And they're going to affect everybody. And whether it's nano or whether it's biotech or whether it's just the intensification of, you know, other kinds of technology. But, you know, that is another, in a very critical, you know, development question. And I think some of it comes down to, you know, the two different ways in which we use this word, you know, development, or the way that we think about change. You know, some people have talked about little d development and big D development. You know, little d development is the unfolding of, you know, transformative change across the world, you know, in a capitalist economy. And, you know, big D development is how do we intervene into systems and into communities in order to try to, you know, bring about change in favor of the most vulnerable. You know, how do we change things? And I think, you know, we haven't talked very much on a more theoretical level, I think, about these issues. We've talked very much about, you know, particular examples and particular approaches. But I think it would be good for us to, you know, to step back and to look at it within some of these broader frameworks.
Scott Lacey, AfricanSky.org. As an anthropologist that often serves as a mediator or an interlocutor between technology experts, both in very, very small rural villages in Mali and technology experts looking to help or serve these very people, I rely on metaphors, common denominator metaphors, to try to gain common ground. And one I'd like to offer for our group today is really echoing what David just said, what Moses had said, and several others in the room this morning. And that is, I'm afraid that we're concentrating so much on what we're going to have for dinner when we haven't even figured out how we're going to get breakfast. And I think one of the most important issues for me that we should be discussing is the very idea that technology is a physical manifestation of inequality. And inequality doesn't necessarily have to be evil, doesn't have to be socially a negative sort of thing. There are physical inequalities, there are moral inequalities. But I'm afraid right now we really haven't done anything to practice what we're preaching, which is the trickle up versus the trickle down. Because we're focusing on dinner, we are relying still on this 40 to maybe 400-year pattern of trickle down. And in fact, I don't have the solution, but I'm just saying I find myself rather frustrated at times because, as I said in my group yesterday, if my dear host brother from Mali of 16 years was sitting beside me and I was trying to explain what was going on here just to get his perspective, the one perspective he would give is, I don't know what to tell these people I want because none of this matters to me. And when we discussed what it might be, what one thing from the conference might be that would help out. We talked about sensors. And these are people that don't necessarily, they do need technology, but they also have technology, and they have great smarts in using and applying limited resources to very difficult growing conditions, both culturally and environmentally. And so maybe we can focus a little bit more on the pre-existing knowledge sets of our partners, not our participants, but our partners in technology development, and we might be able to find a way to focus a little more on breakfast. And we do need some specialists to be thinking about dinner, and I hope that they continue to get good funding for it, but I sure would like 0.01% of their budget to basically put some sensors into work in Mali.
Others at this point? I think that was really helpful. Think about, so we'll have a little bit more discussion after we have a break, and then we've got another panel, which I'm excited about, and then a little bit more discussion at the end, and I think perhaps your comments and David's comments are very helpful. I think we'll, in that closing session, we'll start to wrap things up, talk a little bit more specifically about what might be helpful in terms of furthering the conversation and this dialogue that we started here, maybe some means of doing that, but also maybe start thinking about anything you'd like to share on kind of what you're taking away from this conference. How is it going to impact what you're going to be doing in the next year or so? I'd like to come back to that in the closing session. So we've got a break, 15-minute break. Well, actually, we've got a little bit more time, I think. So back in here at 10:45. Thank you.